the landscape is very similar to that of heavy industry or the state of heavy industry.
Welcome, listeners, to the Industrial Security Podcast. My name is Nate Nelson. I'm here as usual with Andrew Ginter, the Vice President of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions. He's going to introduce the subject and the guest of our show today. Andrew, how's it going?
I'm very well, thank you, Nate. Our guest today is Miral Sehig. He is the General Manager of Cybersecurity Practice for Honeywell Building Technologies, HBT, and our topic is cybersecurity for building automation, especially insights from a recent report on that topic.
Great. Then without further ado, here's you speaking with Miral.
Hello, Miral, and thank you for joining us. Before we get started, can you give us a bit of background about yourself and about the good work that you're doing at Honeywell Building Technologies?
Thank you, Andrew. Great to share this time with you and the listeners. So a little bit about me. Look, I've been across the critical infrastructure industry in some form or another for the past 12 or so years. So I really started in the control systems engineering space. So think about this as working mainly with heavy industry, refining, gas processing, mining, and chemical. And this is really where I cut my teeth on the various elements that really make up these process control environments. It's funny, I actually remember one of the most beautiful sights in my working career. I was actually on an oil rig in the middle of nowhere, looking over the ocean while working on a new flare stack implementation and control philosophy. So those were some fun times, certainly in the industrial space. Now, through all of these great adventures and working with some stellar teams and customers, a theme really started to creep up. And so more and more often, we were seeing a single point of ownership around the industrial control environment start to pop up. So all these components I mentioned, DCSs, SCADA systems, so on and so forth, as well as the ICT systems, so the Internet Communication Technology layer, compute, virtualization, storage, networking, and the bubble wrap on top, which is the cybersecurity and the OT environment, all started to come together. And this really, this heavily piqued my interest. It was around this time, so 6 or so years ago, that I joined the Honeywell Building Technologies Group, or HBT. And think about this as a business that facilitates a very similar function to that of the heavy industrial space. So instead of the DCS, we have a BMS, which we use as a single point of control for all things, including access control, digital security and video, lift and elevator systems, so on and so forth. In fact, I think we have one customer of ours that just implemented their 68th integration into our BMS system. So just very, very scalable and extensible system. So anyhow, after moving into the building space, quickly came to realize that this single point of ownership was also started to become a major theme in the buildings area. So, and that for that reason, ICT and cybersecurity practices, we really needed to stand that up quick, because we found that our customers didn't really understand how to navigate this environment. So for the last 6 years, built out our ICT practice, and the last 3 built out our cybersecurity practice as well. And these two, of course, go hand in hand. So needless to say, I've got a terribly exciting job. I wake up every morning thinking about ways I can help educate customers, improve their cyber maturity. So, what's better than that, right?
Okay, and before we dive into the security of building automation, can you talk a bit about the space, building automation? What kind of buildings are we talking about? How are they usually automated? What kind of consequences of cyber attacks in these buildings are we worried about? Are we talking about elevators plummeting to their deaths? Or are we talking about sort of more modest concerns?
It's a great question. Well, first off, buildings are all around us, and all these buildings, they require some level of automation. And so enter the BMS that we spoke about just a second ago. So when thinking about these buildings, we really want to carve this space as a whole out into various verticals, because each vertical would have a different mix of systems that integrate into these BMSs. So maybe just off the cuff, I'll mention a few. We've got premium commercial buildings, which we all know and love. We go into almost every day to do our work. Data centers, hospitals, education. So this could be anything from, here in the US, K through 12 to universities. We have airports. We have correctional facilities. And of course, a newer topic in this space as well, we have smart cities or smart campuses as well. Remember, these BMSs are responsible for controlling and monitoring both the mechanical and electrical systems in a building. So that could be anything from HVAC, lighting, access control, digital security and fire. In the case of, this is a typical case for premium commercial facilities, and this quickly then expands depending on the vertical. So if I go back to hospitals, for example, we would include things like nurse call systems, real-time location systems, or RTLS. If we think about smart cities, we would have smart poles, environmental sensors, traffic management. So naturally, all these systems, they rely on the underlying stuff that we know and love, similar to heavy industry. So we have PLCs, RTUs, we now have the introduction of IoT devices, and they operate mostly over these standard protocols. So Ethernet IP, Modbus, BACnet, OPC, protocols, again, that we're very familiar with. So you have this BMS at the center that manages all of these systems and their interdependencies across the standard ICT infrastructure. Again, the compute, the servers, the workstations. This can be the physical or virtualized storage, the network equipment. And typically this is on a flat network structure, would you believe it? So this is where things start to diverge. When we think about the industrial space, I know we often talk about ISA 99 or the Purdue model when we think about zoning and conduits in the network. But in a building, that we're not there yet. We're really trying to get there. So we also see a lot of outdated or non-existent cyber hygiene, which I'm sure we'll get into. But so we're connecting all these systems to other systems on the network. So IoT and edge devices, as I mentioned, and more broadly, we're connecting buildings to the cloud as well. And of course, this is not just done because we feel like it. It's done to get better decision-making prowess. It's done to improve productivity. It's done to improve the performance of the assets. It's done to improve also the patrons that enter these buildings and use them. So the listeners may be asking themselves, well, what could go wrong? We've got a bunch of great things happening in this space. Well, as we know, if this isn't properly managed, we can quickly go down a path that, we've seen data exfiltration from certain banking and financial services verticals, digital access in premium commercial buildings being disabled, so people can't enter and exit premises, or certain other doors being opened. This can, of course, very quickly cause panic. Lighting systems we've seen disrupted in emergency rooms, in hospitals. Climate control being tampered with in the case of data centers. And as we know, of course, data centers, heating and cooling is very, very important. So if we fall to a certain heating level, it can very quickly trigger these hardware trip points, causing the compute hardware to switch off. So the list of vulnerabilities and threat vectors, I guess, is enormous when we think about this space. So I think we even had an incident where an IoT temperature sensor was used. It was placed in a fish tank, and it was used as Wi-Fi enabled. Was used to gain access to a casino's environment to exfiltrate gigabits worth of data. So hopefully that gives you some sense of what the building is, as well as some of the various topics that we're going to dive into, from threats, vulnerabilities, and how we can even protect some of these buildings.
What you're talking about with morale today is reminding me a lot of a couple of episodes we've done in the past. If I recall correctly, we spoke with Fred Gordy of Intelligent Buildings, his episode about destroying a 300-ton chiller. We've talked about, the thousands and thousands of CPUs that make up the cyber landscape of a tall building.
That's right. And In a sense, what's different about Honeywell here is that they are very big. They're one of the dominant suppliers in the building automation space. I mean, I have a Honeywell thermostat in my own home. So yes, they do data centers and skyscrapers. They also do consumer home automation. And they're also very well known in the industrial automation space. For example, I've run into their process historian database, PhD, a few times. So Honeywell kind of runs the gamut of small to big on the building automation side and small to big in terms of classic industrial automation as well. In there, you mentioned smart cities. I mean, I thought we were talking building automation. Is building automation somehow, I don't know, connected into smart cities?
It's a great question. So smart cities, as we know and love them, are typically categorized by a wide range of tech that really is used to transform the life and working environments within these communities, within these cities, within these precincts. So what this means is the use of ICT, so the technology that we talked about earlier, to expand into areas such as smart mobility, smart grids, waste management, telehealth and smart healthcare, traffic flow management, environmental monitoring and sensing. And we know that's an important part of the sustainability equation these days. So absolutely, buildings do make up the majority of that smart city infrastructure. But these outcomes, they're heavily dependent on the overall interconnected infrastructure. So these smart buildings being a prerequisite to a smart city, because we know these buildings, whether they're a hospital or a stadium, transportation, they weren't connected and have dated OT hygiene practices. And now we're going ahead and connecting them. That's one of the challenges that we like to talk about when embarking on that smart city journey. And I was thinking, smart cities, of course, they're a broad topic and they can become quite complex given the many interconnected systems that we just spoke of. And it's for this reason that we've created a dedicated smart cities practice that really focuses on consultation, installation, and management of these environments. So, and of course, as cyber is a core enabler for this growth, I've also been doing a little bit of work with the World Economic Forum and G20 to set some cyber policies specifically for smart cities. So, we've actually just released a new cyber resilience model policy. If any of the listeners want to check that out, you can head over to globalsmartcityalliance.org. And that's really to bring together the community to enable this technological advancement in a safe manner.
If we're talking smart cities, if we're talking, buildings connected into the smart cities, of course, the more automation we have, the more CPUs we have, the more targets we have. The more connected those targets are, the more opportunity to attack them. This sounds sort of like a recipe for a problem.
So connectivity, it's the key tenet behind smart buildings, which of course, again, leads us back to these smart precincts and smart cities. So this means having the ability to connect previously isolated systems to one another. So that's something new. Think about this as the interconnectivity amongst multiple buildings or systems within a building that were previously isolated. And second, the ability to connect these systems to the cloud and internet-enabled services. And again, this is for improved productivity and business outcomes. So I think a good example that we like to share, and we've been in this space for quite some time, is the example of predictive maintenance and remote operations that we gain from having this level of connectivity. So this connectivity allows us our building operators to access the BMS systems, control everything from access control, HVAC, to security devices like cameras. Now the key here, as you mentioned, Andrew, is that this connectivity is an enabler. It is a producer of business benefits, but it does also inherently, it increases that threat footprint. So when we do connectivity, when we increase these level of touch points, it needs to be done with cybersecurity in mind.
So that was a little abstract. Let me give you a couple of concrete examples of the kind of connectivity we're seeing between buildings and smart cities. The simple one maybe is smart charging. We're seeing a lot more electric vehicles. They want to, plug in at the office and charge. The more vehicles do this, the more the building has to pay for power. I mean, some of these things are free, but nowadays a lot of them you have to sign into. You have to pay for the power yourself. This is all connecting parts of the building with power connections into the electric infrastructure. Maybe a different example, sort of more city-like, is arenas. If you have an arena with 50,000 people in it, the game might go into overtime. The game might be done on time. It might be done early. Who knows? These arenas nowadays can signal the traffic system saying, "Okay, we're done. We're letting people out. Go into get these people out of here mode," and all the traffic signals change to facilitate getting tens of thousands of vehicles out of the arena over the next 10, 20 minutes. So, these are some examples of what we're talking about in terms of, increased connectivity.
Cyber attacks with physical consequences more than doubled in 2021. For industrial victims, the most common consequences were production outages at multiple sites. Most of the attacks were ransomware. And 2021 saw the first cloud-based ransomware attack. That attack compromised 1,500 businesses in the space of 45 minutes. These and other insights are included in a new threat report, co-authored by Waterfall Security Solutions and the new ICS Strive Industrial Incident Repository. For your copy of the report, please visit icsstrive.com. That's ICSSTRIVE.com.
Can you give me, maybe an idea of how much trouble we're in? I mean, I track heavy industry, and last year there were 22 public incidents that impacted operations, in rails, in agriculture, in pipelines, obviously. A lot of the incidents took down multiple sites, often for several days. They were almost all ransomware. Have there been incidents in building automation, and can you characterize them? What are you seeing?
Well, what's interesting is that we've actually gone and gathered some insights. We've actually just done a recent OT-focused threat report within the building space, and we found that around 27% of our respondents have actually experienced some type of cyber breach, and that was within a rolling 12-month period. We also found we had about 71% consider OT cyber a concern or something to worry about. And only 44% of respondents thought that they had some system in place to help them mitigate, help them eliminate, help them prevent a potential threat. So if we break this down, when we talk about cyber breaches in building OT systems, I mean, we see everything from data breaches, so exfiltration of data, which may include some type of PII. We see ransomware attacks, which of course causes disruption to services. We even see DDoS attacks as well on certain heavily connected sites that have no cybersecurity principles in mind. We also see active control of compromised systems, so access control, for example, security devices like cameras. We also have various edge cases, and we see things like session hijacking in remote support staff, or proximity card jacking as well. It's more of a social engineering hack, but certainly something prevalent in the building space. So most certainly there have been many incidents, some public, some not. And recently we've actually seen some threat actors targeting hospitals in particular. So this has actually resulted in some very, very high profile incidents. One was actually loss of life, which is very, very unfortunate. But ultimately, these incidents aren't slowing down. So as we saw, 71 of respondents consider OT either a concern or something to worry about. And when we think and peel it back to 44% thinking that they do have some level of protection in place, this is if we go one level down here, this is really thinking about the product security elements. I think that number is quite a little bit lower when we think about the overall OT environment as a whole versus just a specific product. So it's a very, very interesting time to be involved in this space, and very interesting time to be educating our clients and customers to be able to prevent, mitigate some of these vulnerabilities that could stop any threats.
So 27% of buildings, I mean, there's a lot of buildings in the world, even if we just count, I don't know, skyscrapers and data centers, but there's a lot of buildings in the world. That sounds like a lot of incidents. Is it 27% of the buildings? Is it, or, I don't know, is it 27% of the building owners? And, most the big building owners have lots of buildings and, one of their buildings got hit. What do we know what that statistic actually turns into?
That's right. It certainly is a lot of breaches, and these are the ones that we know or we've been told do exist. So there's certainly others that we know exist, given we've actually mobilized our incident response services to assist when a breach does occur. So, example, we've been called out to help in cases where ransomware has consumed an entire OT environment, and doing some further forensics, and we find some shadow IT devices or shadow OT devices in this case that had also been compromised, but with a different level of threat, but people just weren't aware. So these are just the ones that we are told do exist, but certainly this is a frightening time because it does occur in areas like hospitals, where I mentioned earlier. Now, look, they do happen on a more frequent scale, just given the sheer amount of buildings operating globally and the current level of OT hygiene practices. Remember, the way we're defining a building here is everything that is pretty much not heavy industry. So to better prepare these buildings, OT environments, where we're at minimum advocating doing the minimal hygiene requirements, which of course we can jump to. But time and time again, I just see that we're not ready from an incident readiness perspective. So really building out those SOPs around incident response. You can lean heavy on some of the NIST special publications. I believe it's 800-61, and where we talk about preparedness, detection, containment, recovery, eradication, and of course the post-event activity. Because what we tend to find is when an incident does occur, the stakeholders involved, we kind of get phone calls from every side. So having this plan that's crystal clear in terms of who's involved, what are the SLAs, really gives us that ability to respond. Now, of course, we don't like to get into that situation. We like to try to mitigate and eliminate as much as we can. But in case that we do, we advocate for these incident readiness and advisory plans to be put in place.
Nate, let's look at these numbers for a second. Muriel talked about 27% of respondents in the survey said they had been breached. Now, it wasn't clear to me if these were OT breaches or IT breaches. But even if they were kind of OT-ish, I got the sense from Muriel that, they might not, my 22 incidents where a whole plant went down, a site went down. So if a whole building, I don't know, was evacuated because, the HVAC failed, that would have showed up sort of on my radar. But if the building management system, a remote building management system, lost contact with the building because of a distributed denial of service that targeted the building's IP address, that didn't actually have a physical consequence. We just lost visibility into the building from our remote monitoring system for a bit. So something like that would not have showed up on my radar. Some hacker gaining control of I don't know, cameras and boasting to the world, hey, I can look inside this building, again, would not have showed up on my radar. Someone, I don't know, persuading one of the people legitimately allowed into a skyscraper with 10,000 people in it, persuading one of those people to lend them a swipe card and sneak into the building as that person, again, might have counted as a breach. to a building owner, but again, wouldn't have showed up on my radar. Now, the hospitals don't show up on my 22 incidents either when I did that report, when Greg Hale and I did that report. But we did note in the report there were like over a dozen hospital incidents we kind of ran into by accident. This is not something I was searching for, but yeah, hospitals, it's a big deal, and there have been deaths associated with those attacks. So, the 27% sounds like a whole mix of stuff, but to a large extent, I'm guessing. I don't have the data. This is just sort of my interpretation of what's going on with sort of those two very different numbers. So that's interesting. This survey, what else did you learn in the survey?
So we've already covered a few points. I think it was interesting to really get to hear about the forces that are driving some of these breaches. And I think I like to place them into two groups. So one, there is a general lack of understanding and awareness when it comes to buildings, OT, cyber, and building OT environments in general. And of course, implications could lead to a lot of these different breaches that we've seen, as we've already covered. These impacts include lack of access control, lighting systems, HVAC, fire suppression, things of this nature. And it really comes to a lack of understanding and a lack of ownership and decision-making and accountability. So meaning the teams that support these OT environments, and we see typically that's the operations staff, do not really have the oversight, they don't have the budget to cover the necessary OT hygiene. And they may not even understand why they need to be doing those things, because it is a new topic of discussion. Now, where we tend to see a majority of action is in countries where critical infrastructure is becoming more regulated. So Singapore, now Australia, the UK and other European nations. India is a big hub for smart cities. And so that's a good, positive move in the right direction. And where we see, where we do have that centralized stakeholder management, and this is typically within a CISO. A CISO will have someone appointed to sit across both IT and OT as that central point of ownership. I think that's critical. So where we see that real maturity shift is where we have these standards in place and where we have that ownership accountability, and we can really drive some change.
So, that kind of makes sense. Can you work an example for me? You come into a typical building that's, been around for 10 or 20 years. But this is a sort of a new client for you folks. What do you see? Are there issues in common when you sort of come in cold like that?
It's quite interesting. The landscape is very similar to that of heavy industry, or the state of heavy industry, maybe some 8 to 10 or so years ago, with a few additional quirks, a few additional areas of focus. And I think some examples. So we see outdated operating system patches, devices not being updated, so firmware on those devices, unmanaged endpoints. And this could include anything from the cameras, the controllers, connected devices, RFID readers, and so on and so forth. We've still got certain areas, unencrypted comms channels at the device level, so certain applications that aren't using encrypted communication. We've got unknown assets on the network, including those shadow OT devices that I mentioned. And this is typically because there's no formal architecture drawing. So asset management hasn't been a priority. We see uncontrolled internet connectivity. So and typically we see this when there's a vendor and they do some commissioning on a device and they want to get scalability and do it remotely, and they forget to disconnect their connectivity and it just sits there dormant and no one's aware of it. So we see that quite a bit actually. And we lack of good authentication practices, so default credentials, unmanaged devices like firewalls, unmanaged rules on managed network devices, switches, routers, and so on and so forth. As I mentioned a few times now, we see flat network architectures with a mix of vendors and really unknown operational management routines. So one vendor may be doing really, really well to keep up their cyber hygiene and the others may not. and we just have that on a flat network, which, as we know, is a bit of a concern. We see USBs being used in typically offline environments where there's no internet connectivity, and those USBs aren't vetted. Those USBs aren't put through any check cycles. They're just plugged in, used at leisure. Of course, that can introduce some vulnerabilities there. Lack of ownership. I've talked about that a little bit. There's no central ownership on the overall OT environment, and minimal to no planning on incident readiness and response. So, of course, these are some of the things we do see. There's a few other things as well in these environments, depending on the vertical. But I think the silver lining here is that we are seeing that similar trend to heavy industry. And that the more and more we're highlighting these areas, the more and more we're pushing for technological advancement across these environments, the more we're educating these buildings, OT stakeholders, the more we're engaging to support, we're actually getting to a point where we're seeing that same level of maturity. That maturity curve is escalating, where there are budgets being made available, there are roles being created, and there are people that can help, at least from a starting perspective of understanding what needs to be done to get you to that next level of maturity.
Okay. And so, if the maturity isn't there, but it's coming about, presumably someone's bringing it about. What do you do when you run into one of these, immature sites? How do you bring them up to speed?
So if we peel this back a little bit, when we think about the doing, it's not uncommon to see many people just jumping to a specific product. That product, they imagine, could be a silver bullet, right? So, and that's going to move us from level 1 maturity to level 5. But as your listeners do know, that isn't reality in most instances. So where our clients do see value is in our risk-based road mapping approach. So that's the necessary first step that we take, in that we really work with our customers and our clients to understand their risk appetite. As I mentioned throughout this discussion, different verticals, different areas of focus, different risk appetite. So there's certain businesses that are willing to take on more risk, others not so much. So we then build out this cybersecurity uplift program to suit that level of risk appetite. So for example, certain buildings with a higher risk appetite and a minimal budget would potentially have a program that include only a few layers of protection. Whereas others with a lower risk appetite that include more layers of protection. As we know, it's a common defense in-depth strategy. And the additional benefit to our approach is that we really aim to simplify the requirements while matching to real business benefits. Because as we know, these requirements do need to be budgeted for and, of course, generate some effective business impact. So the typical layers that make up our road mapping exercise, this can include risk and asset gap analysis specific to buildings OT, secure configuration or hardening of all the end devices, network segmentation, secure design, so ISA 99, IEC 62443, and this includes all of the wonderful things that do make up our common network infrastructure, switches, next-gen firewalls, IPS, IDS, so on and so forth, endpoint protection, disaster recovery, patch management, and performance monitoring. That's very, very critical as one of the base layers. And then everything to cybersecurity risk and compliance monitoring, threat detection and response, and incident advisory and readiness.
So Meryl mentioned risk appetite there a bit. I mean, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. I'm trying to write a book on the topic of risk. I was at a conference last week, and the topic of sort of the risk appetite of the board came up at a roundtable, and so I took a bunch of notes. Just to provide a bit of perspective on what is risk appetite and how hard can it be to persuade people to do stuff. The sense I got was that a great many, not all, certainly not all, but a great many boards, they do what they have to do. If they don't do certain things, they get sued as decision makers who should have known do better. So, what does move the needle? The boards look backwards. If there's a history of big problems in a field of risk, whatever it is, hurricanes, cyber risk, whatever, that tends to motivate them to do something about the risk. If there's a regulation, they of course have to comply with the regulation, or they get shareholder lawsuits. When the company gets fined, but generally speaking, boards want to focus on building shareholder value, so they do as little of everything else as they have to. Reputation is something that is intangible, but is something the board cares about, especially if it's a business that's spent billions of dollars on brands, which a lot of businesses do over the course of time. But something that surprised me was, if there's a really big incident like, I don't know, NotPetya or WannaCry that hits hundreds or thousands of businesses, that surprisingly doesn't really impair the reputation of the business, because the business can say, oh, we got hit just like everybody else did. It's not that we did anything particularly wrong. A lot of what motivates the board is what are the our peers in the competitive environment doing? What are they doing about security? Are we sort of ahead of the curve or behind the curve? They sort of want to be in the middle of the pack. When he talks about risk appetite, this is sort of some of the next level of complexity that I've run into in discussing the topic with people who try to spring funding loose for cybersecurity programs.
Right. A lot of that makes sense to me. I would imagine that of those factors you just named, the history of a problem is probably the thing that someone like Mirel would run into the most issue with, right? Because building automation security, while important, is not the kind of thing that in the past has made headlines.
That's certainly true. And I think this is part of why, people do these surveys to try and find out how much trouble is the industry in. But you mentioned headlines. The other thing that came up at the conference, at the roundtable, was the war in the Ukraine. They said when that invasion started, when Russia invaded, all of the headlines were, shields up, lock down your critical infrastructure. And that actually made a difference in terms of the board's, a lot of boards' willingness to do something in the short term. But again, the feedback, we are now in June, that happened back in February. The feedback was, it's been in the news for 4 months. People are sort of, the board members that the people at the roundtable were dealing with, they're sort of drifting back to their original risk appetite. The effect of the headlines is wearing off. So it's a complicated space to try and get sort of consistent funding for cybersecurity initiatives. Well, Meryl, this has been good. Thank you for joining us. Before we let you go, is there a thought you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Well, look, a big thank you, Andrew. It's been great to chat with you. Sure, just some brief takeaways. So our buildings and cities, they're becoming smarter day by day. That's a given. And as we continue on this journey, we've got a lot of technological advancement. We've got lots of consumer and provider benefits, and we cannot forget about the underlying OT cybersecurity. There are cybersecurity controls that we need in place as a foundation. So it's fantastic to be here talking, communicating this message. Now, I understand through the brief Q&A that we have, it may sound like a daunting task, what with so many different products, solutions, and services in the wild today. But if we stick to these simple rules of thumb, always start with the basics, understand our risk appetite, assess our environment, ensure that we're asking more from our providers. How can our providers help us with operational technology cybersecurity? And of course, just a note for the listeners here, this is different. OT cybersecurity is different to the traditional product cybersecurity. I mean, the entire OT environment, irrespective of the products that are operating in that frame, we need to make sure we have some level of improved hygiene. And remember, we're not defenseless. In fact, we're only getting stronger And the more we work with these key stakeholders to educate and put in place plans, the better our ability to eliminate, eradicate, and of course, mitigate some of these threats. So thank you to all the listeners. We'll be sending a link where you can download the report of our findings. And of course, you can find me on LinkedIn as well. So do drop me a note. I'd love to continue this conversation with any of the listeners. And of course, we can end up talking for hours on this topic. So again, thank you, Andrew.
That was your conversation with Muriel. Andrew, in general, I like hearing about building automation. The security issues that face various industries all end up being relevant to us. Water treatment, of course, it affects our lives, nuclear facilities, the electric grid, but buildings just are more present in my life. And so it's easier to imagine what the consequences of getting this wrong would be. The image of, say an elevator getting stuck on the 26th floor of a building where I'm from in Manhattan is enough to get me to really feel for the mission that Muriel and Honeywell are going after.
That's right. I mean, it is an important space. 5 years ago, at Waterfall, we're a cybersecurity provider. We just did not see any sort of activity in the building automation space. Nowadays, we're seeing, again, most of our customers are heavy industry, but we're seeing the biggest buildings coming to us. We have casinos as customers. We have large data centers as customers. So this is an issue that is becoming top of mind for at least the very largest sites, and hopefully smaller ones as well, because as you point out, it affects all of us. What surprised me in the session here in the episode was, Muriel telling me that I think it was 27% of buildings had suffered OT breaches or breaches. I think they were OT breaches. But again, I haven't heard of these things, and I certainly know I scour the newspapers from time to time. I go to Google, I search for these things. I heard about the hospitals, but really not much beyond that. 27% is huge. I mean, I live in Calgary. We have, if 27% of the office buildings downtown got hit, it would have been, a dozen buildings that got hit over the course of the last year. So, if there's people out there who have experience with breaches, cyber breaches in building automation, I'd love to have you guys, give me a call and, bring you on the show, and let's talk about what's happening in that field in more detail.
Great. But for now, thanks to Muriel Sahik for speaking with you, Andrew. And as always, Andrew, thank you for speaking with me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Nate.
This has been the Industrial Security Podcast from Waterfall Security Solutions. Thanks to everybody out there listening.